Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Fisher. I'm the Director of Advocacy Engagement here at MDA, and we are thrilled that you're joining us today for our next edition of the MDA Advocacy Institute, where we'll talk about proposed FDA reforms. I know for many in the neuromuscular community, clinical trials and drug and therapy development is a sign of hope, but also can be a big source of frustration. And we're really hoping that some upcoming efforts to reform the FDA and its clinical trials and drug development will help advance some much needed changes. Before I dive into where we're going to talk about, just a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A that's in the bottom of your screen. We will answer them. We'll try to answer them throughout the presentation if we can get them in, but we also have a section at the end for Q&A, so feel free to please put them in and we'll answer them as many as we can. Also, I know that some of you might not be members of our grassroots advocacy list. So if you're not a member of our MDA grassroots program, we really encourage you to join. And there are two ways you can do that. You can go to mda.org/advocacy, or you can also text MDA USA to 50457. So if you're new to us, welcome. We're so thrilled you're here, but please join us as we lead some of these efforts. And for those who have been advocates for a long time, I can't thank you enough for continuing to advocate with us. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about, as the title slide says, proposed FDA reform efforts. And those are really going to be done through something called user fee agreements. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is, and then we'll talk about two specific ones, which are the PDUFA agreement and the MDUFA agreement, which might be my two new favorite words that I learned these last couple of weeks about what they are. We'll go into them. We promise we won't be overly technical, but really these represent some really nice, a great chance for us to reform some of the efforts we'll have some chances to reform the FDA in ways that can really help the neuromuscular community. So this is a great shot for us to do that through these user fee agreements. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And as always, we'll share how you can help us. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A throughout the time. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul Melmeyer, who is our Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy, to get us going. Paul, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And welcome again to our Advocacy Institute, with today's topic being on FDA reforms. And of course, as you can see through the agenda slide in front of you, we can get wonky very quickly as we're going to be talking about some of these big Washington acronyms that really to anyone outside the Beltway can be quite perplexing. I mean, PDUFA, MDUFA, and I'm going to mention some other user fee agreements as well, certainly can seem quite wonky, but in reality, actually, they can make such a huge difference in the development and approval of new treatments for those with neuromuscular diseases. And I'll walk you through all of that as we go along during our hour together. I'm also very, very grateful that it will not just be me who you will be listening to talking about these items. We're also very pleased to have Dr. Sharon Hesterly, MDA's Executive Vice President and Chief Research Officer, with us. She is expert in all things neuromuscular disease drug development, especially those things that I certainly have no background or expertise on myself. So Sharon, thank you again for joining us, and we'll turn to you in just a moment once we start talking about some of the exciting things within especially the Prescription Drug User Fee Act reauthorization itself. But before we get there, if we can move on to the next slide, I just want to just kind of start at a baseline level of what MDA advocacy advocates for within the context of therapeutic development. And it really is just the sentence that you see in front of you here. MDA pursues policy change that will meaningfully accelerate the development of more and better treatments, devices, and diagnostics for the neuromuscular disease community. And that's everything that we strive for as we look at new legislation up on Capitol Hill, as we look at proposed reforms at the Food and Drug Administration. What we first ask ourselves is, will this result in more and better treatments for our community? And if so, then we're going to look for ways to get involved and really try to push for those very policies to actually be either administered and implemented at the FDA or perhaps enacted by Congress. And of course, that's the lens that we're going to be looking at the Prescription Drug User Fee Act and the other user fee reauthorizations. Will this agreement actually meaningfully accelerate the development of more and better therapies for our community? So always important just to start at really what are we focused on within our advocacy efforts at MDA, really within all of our efforts at MDA. And we're focused on many things, but as it pertains to new treatment development, this is our North Star in a sense. And this is our North Star certainly as we look at policies that we'll be reviewing today. So let's move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there are many user fee agreements. And before I get into any of these, because I know that you're probably looking at this and thinking, why the heck do we have animal user fees in front of us today? And it's a very good question. But what user fees are more generally, just to kind of back up all the way to the 30,000 foot level, is they are fees that the industry that is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And it's important to remember the FDA actually regulates about a quarter of the entire United States economy, which is just mind-boggling if you think about just how broad that is. But nearly a quarter of the US economy is regulated by the FDA. And what these regulated industries and FDA realized over the course of their regulatory experience together, I guess you could say, is that FDA was chronically and is still chronically underfunded. The FDA is not funded in a way that is recognized that it actually regulates a quarter of the economy. It would be funded a lot more if it was actually funded at the level that it should with the responsibilities that it has. And that's on Congress. And we're not going to cover today what we're doing to try to get more appropriations to the FDA. But what the FDA and regulated industries realized was that something needed to change because FDA was just given a task that was far too monumental for what was actually being appropriated to complete. So what that resulted in are these user fee agreements in front of you. And that means that the regulated industry, let's take prescription drugs, for example, the pharmaceutical company pays a fee to the US Food and Drug Administration to review its therapy within certain parameters. So within a certain amount of time, in certain kinds of ways, using certain kinds of programs that have been agreed to previously. And in return, the pharmaceutical company will pay a fee to the Food and Drug Administration. Those fees can vary and there's different fee programs, but it's supposed to ensure that that funding, that in this case, within the context of PDUFA or the pharmaceutical industry, that funding will contribute to ensuring that treatments actually make it through the FDA and are reviewed by the FDA in an appropriate amount of time. And that was actually the very first user fee agreement, I believe, that was created at the Food and Drug Administration. And I'll get a little bit into the history of PDUFA here in a moment. But as you can see, many other user fee programs have been created over the last 30 years as a result. As there's animal drug user fee programs and biosimilar user fee programs and over-the-counter monograph user fee programs. So virtually any product that is going through the FDA for review before it can actually hit the market and consumers can purchase that product, there is oftentimes a user fee agreement in place to ensure that that review happens in a timely manner. So thankfully today, we're not going to be actually going through all of these. Instead, to move to the next slide, we'll just be talking about two of them, the Medical Device User Fee Act and the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And we're actually just going to be spending most of our time on PDUFA, but we will touch a little bit on MDUFA. So let's talk a little bit more about PDUFA, if we can go to the next slide. So this is a graph that I shamelessly stole from our wonderful colleagues over at the National Health Council. Thank you, National Health Council, for putting together an excellent graph such as this. But it gives you a good idea of the evolution of PDUFA over the course of the last 30 years, approximately at this point. And as I mentioned before, way back in the early 90s, the FDA and regulated industry, as well as patient groups, were seeing review times at the Food and Drug Administration just continue to stretch because more and more new treatments were coming to the Food and Drug Administration for their review, yet the resources for them to actually review these therapies weren't keeping up. And so review times were extending, beyond a year to a year and a half, 2 years, even longer in some cases. I'll show you a graph on that in a second, but it was obvious that something needed to be done, and that's what created PDUFA 1, the very first PDUFA agreement that was enacted in 1993. And actually, that very first one was meant mostly just to reduce the backlog of applications that were sitting at the FDA. It wasn't even as much to set specific review times or reduce specific review times. It was just there were lots of new drugs just waiting to be reviewed by FDA, and they weren't being reviewed just because FDA did not have the resources to do so. So that's what PDUFA 1 addressed way back in 1993. PDUFA 2 came around in 5 years later because PDUFA 1 also set a 5-year reauthorization timeline for every single one of these new Prescription Drug User Fee Act reauthorizations. So Congress has to renew this every single 5 years. They have to give the Food and Drug Administration the authority to actually accept the user fees and all the parameters that come with those user fees that FDA and the regulated industry negotiate. So 5 years later, PDUFA 2 comes along. And of course, PDUFA not being a particularly nice name that is well marketed and branded, these PDUFA agreements, starting with PDUFA 2, were given different names. In this case, FDAMA, which is an acronym for Food and Drug Administration Monetization Act. In any case, PDUFA 2 was there to reduce review times. PDUFA 3 and 4 in the ensuing 10 years focused a little bit more on safety and on consumer engagement and on whether the drugs that were actually being approved by the Food and Drug Administration had adequate amounts of safety data, and were ensuring that if a drug was to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, it was safe to use by the broader population. So as you can see within PDUFA 4, PDUFA 4 tried to address potential unintended consequences of accelerating review times to ensure that if they were to be accelerated, that safety was still ensured for new drugs being approved by the Food and Drug Administration. PDUFA 5 came around in 2013, and this is really where we start to see a sea change in what is in these Prescription Drug User Fee Acts, where now within PDUFA 5, we start to see patient organizations getting more engaged. And we start to see organizations like the Muscular Dystrophy Association, who was engaged back then, and of course now continues to be engaged in these agreements, advocate for changes to how FDA actually administers these review programs. And those changes are reflected in PDUFA 5, including an actual structured benefit risk framework that FDA needs to consider. Now, instead of FDA considering just around the conference room table up in White Oak, Maryland, what they think might be important or what they think might be a tangible benefit to a patient with a certain disease and what risks they might be able to actually incur in order to take a new therapy. That there's actually a structured process for considering the benefits and the risks that a patient with a disease would take into account as they're considering a new therapy, and specifically the therapy that FDA is reviewing at that time. This was also the creation of the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, which I'll say a little bit more about here in a few moments. That was all created as part of the 2013 PDUFA 5 reauthorization. Also, for one of the very first times, the FDA actually launched a rare diseases program, specifically focused on rare diseases and rare disease drug development as part of PDUFA 5. PDUFA 6, just 3 years ago at this point, built on a lot of what was first created within PDUFA 5, including the next steps in patient-focused drug developments and next steps in the development of patient preference information and patient experience data and real-world evidence. Also expanded on the rare disease program that was created as part of PDUFA 5, and also implemented some other reforms that complemented reforms that were passed as part of the 21st Century Cures Act 1 year prior, and really just took the FDA even further in trying to incorporate the patient voice in not only drug development, but also drug reviews. So these are the 6 PDUFA agreements that have been passed to this day. But again, the important thing to remember, and to move to the next slide, is that PDUFA first and foremost is meant to address if new therapies are being reviewed by the FDA in a timely manner. And this is a graph from FDA that I especially like, and it really shows you how the PDUFAs over each PDUFA cycle has actually accelerated the review of therapies with each PDUFA. As you can see in the orange line, this is pre-PDUFA. This is how quickly FDA would review a new drug prior to the PDUFA agreement. Only, let's say, about 17 to 18% of new drugs were actually reviewed and approved within a year, whereas only 70% were actually reviewed and approved within 3 years. It paints quite a picture when over half of new therapies prior to PDUFA were taking over 2 years to actually make it through the FDA. And think about it as an advocate yourself. If you're advocating for a new drug and the clinical trial has been completed, all the data is done, the package is submitted to FDA, and then we have to wait around for 2 years for the FDA to actually review that data. this is why patient advocates were behind PDUFA in the first place, because that's unacceptable. But as you can see, with each passing PDUFA agreement from there, the review timelines have quickened. And now, under PDUFA 5, which again was a 2013 to 2018 PDUFA agreement, we have over 70% of new drugs being having completed their reviews by 1 year, and many more than that, actually almost 90% shortly thereafter. And that's PDUFA 5. We don't even have the data yet for PDUFA 6 because we're still in PDUFA 6 right now. But the point of this slide is again to show that PDUFA is accomplishing its goal of accelerating the review of new treatments. And that is primarily the #1 focus of what PDUFA agreements do, to make sure these new, safe, and effective treatments actually reach our patient populations as quickly as they possibly can. So let's move to the next slide, because I want to talk about the PDUFA that we're in right now, because you're hearing me give you quite the history lesson of the last 30 years, and you probably didn't sign up for a history lesson today. So let's talk about where we are right now. And this is another slide that I, again, shamelessly stole from the Food and Drug Administration. So it's just a little bit outdated because you can see that we're not in the final public meeting today. However, we are just after the final public meeting, which was on September 28th. So just about 3 weeks ago at this point. But before I get to that, let me talk to you about the process of actually reauthorizing this agreement, because it's very instructive and will kind of give you an idea before we get into the nitty-gritty of just what actually the important reforms are within the agreement, how they are crafted. So first of all, this whole process kicked off last summer. FDA held a public meeting in which they invited patient advocates and they invited regulated industry to join them to talk about this next Prescription Drug User Fee Act and everything that would want to see within the Prescription Drug User Fee Act reauthorization. From there, FDA and industry took several months to negotiate, okay, so what are they actually going to agree to in return for regulated industry providing funds to FDA? What are the programs and the review timelines FDA will agree to in return? From there, once that agreement was finalized, which it was over this summer, they, of course, finalized the agreement. They went through the requisite clearance process within the federal government, and then they finalized the package from there. And once they did that, they were able to announce that they finalized the package. And we want to present, we being FDA and industry, wanted to present to the general public what is actually within this final package. That is the meeting that happened on September 28th. That is the meeting that I stole the slide from on September 28th. So right now we are in that 1 month comment period of where all of the rest of us get the comments on, do we like it? Do we not like it? Did they hit the nail on the head? Could they do more of this? Could they do less of that? And actually MDA is going to be submitting comments by the deadline, which is October 28th, which you see here at the bottom of the slide, next week on precisely the things we like, the things we think could be better, and from there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these agreements have to be actually approved by Congress. Congress actually has to sign off on these agreements between FDA and regulated industry. And that process is going to kick off at the beginning of next year. And that's when the package is transmitted to Congress. And then from there, Congress has to actually take the language of this agreement, put it into legislative text, and then pass it out of both houses of Congress, and then sign into law by President Biden. So I'm going to get to that process a little bit later, because that's where you all are going to come in. But as you can see, from start to finish, this is about a 2-year process. We're a little over halfway through right now, but we do know everything that FDA and industry want to be within this next PDUFA agreement, and that's what we're going to be reviewing here momentarily. But before I get to that, one more thing before we get to what's in the agreement that we want to present. We can move to the next slide. And that is what MDA actually prioritized for this very agreement last summer. I mentioned last year, last summer, this whole process kicked off when everyone got together at a big public meeting and said, this is what we want to see within this agreement. And MDA actually, we were able to speak at this public meeting, and we were able to, in service of the neuromuscular disease community, say, as we're aware of ongoing issues within neuromuscular disease drug development, these are the things that we believe should be prioritized by the FDA and by the regulated industry as part of this agreement. These are the things that we believe would make a meaningful impact in accelerating the development of new treatments for neuromuscular diseases. And I'm just going to review these very briefly, because you'll see some of these being brought back within the actual agreement that was officially negotiated and agreed upon by FDA and regulated industry here in a moment. But first of all, we called for increased resources for gene and cell-based therapeutic reviews. Sharon and I will be talking about the importance of gene and cell-based therapies for the neuromuscular disease community here momentarily. And so, of course, making sure FDA is ready to review these therapies is very important. We talked about the importance of decentralized trials, and what those are clinical trials that happen either from one's home or from one's community setting. You know, actually getting rid of the need to travel all the way to that medical center hundreds of miles away to participate within a clinical trial. We again talked about the next steps in incorporating the patient voice in drug development, as well as then the regulatory review of that drug actually at the FDA. We called out the need of innovative regulatory mechanisms to actually review neuromuscular disease drugs, and how the next phase of the rare diseases program at the FDA could facilitate such innovative approaches. And then finally, in trying to accelerate this whole process, the importance of expedited review programs and how they could be strengthened and expanded upon at the Food and Drug Administration, if these provisions could be included within the next User Fee Act. So I invite all of you to take a look at these comments if you'd like. We submitted them last August. You see the screenshot of the very first page of these comments here on the right side of your screen. But understanding that this is one of our best opportunities to actually meaningfully accelerate therapeutic development through policy and regulatory change, we were sure to put all of these into the Food and Drug Administration and regulated industry as what they should be focusing on as they're negotiating to ensure that the neuromuscular disease patient population was well considered during these negotiations. Okay, so I finally, after all of this introduction, want to move towards what is actually in this PDUFA agreement, because you probably all waited on the edge of your seats wanting to know what is actually agreed to by FDA and industry, what will be hopefully passed by Congress next year, and then what can we actually anticipate being implemented by the Food and Drug Administration from there, and how may it actually benefit our community. So the very first thing that we wrote about within our letter to the FDA in 2020 as comments to that public meeting was the importance of gene and cell-based therapies to the neuromuscular disease community, and just how challenging the situation could be for FDA in reviewing the wave of gene therapies soon arriving at the Food and Drug Administration. And I'll get to that in a second. But we also see within this, and we see this addressed within the commitment letter, I should finish by, as it wasn't just us who recognize the importance of gene therapies for the community that any other organization happens to serve, for that matter. Everyone recognizes this importance, and so we're very grateful to see this addressed within the commitment letter, and we'll give some finer points on that in a moment. We also see within the commitment letter negotiated by the FDA and by regulated industry next steps on rare disease innovation. Not only continuing what FDA is doing right now within rare diseases, but actually expanding that work and focusing on developing new efficacy endpoints for rare disease clinical trials. And I'll also give more detail on what that precisely means here in a moment as well. We see the next steps for patient-focused drug development within the commitment letter. As I already mentioned, created in 2013 and then built upon in 2018, we see again FDA and regulated industry building on the work they've already done to advance even further patient-focused drug development and the use of the patient voice in the actual therapeutic development process, as well as the approval process at FDA. And then finally, we see several attempts at actually accelerating the development and review of new treatments as part of this PDUFA agreement. And that includes further refinements of our existing expedited approval pathways, which we'll note in a moment. But that also includes the creation of a new one, which is very exciting, the STAR program, which would actually create a new mechanism for FDA to review new treatments even quicker than they can right now, through taking a pilot program that was initially in the Oncology Center of Excellence and expanding it across the entire FDA, including to neurology and to rare diseases, where, of course, our patient population would be most benefited. So I think it's time to dive into some of these, because they really can be quite impactful to developing new treatments within neuromuscular disease. So to move to the next slide. I want to start, as I mentioned, with gene and cell-based therapeutic development. And here over on the right side of your screen, you see the situation that FDA currently faces with new INDs. IND stands for Investigational New Drug, and that's the very first application that a pharmaceutical company submits to FDA to tell them, we intend to test this new product in this patient population, and here's our plan to do it. So it's basically the formal way of telling FDA, we're going to start testing on this new technology within this disease area. And these are the number of applications that have been submitted to FDA, and specifically to the Office of Tissue and Advanced Therapeutics, which is the office that is responsible for gene and cell-based therapy review. These are the number of new INDs, or new applications, that are submitted to FDA over the course of the last, oh goodness, a while now, almost 60 years, I suppose, but up until 2018. And you can see the trend accelerating precipitously. It's nearly one of those hockey stick graphs that you see of new applications coming into FDA fairly consistently from 1990 up until about 2012, 2014 or so. But from there, we go from 2014 of 187 INDs being submitted to FDA all the way to 413 in calendar year 2018. And it's only going to go up further than there in 2019, 20, and 21 of all of these new gene therapies that are being developed right now, and that, shortly after, or maybe not so shortly after, an IND is actually submitted to the FDA, if everything goes well within the clinical trial, then they actually submit a biological licensing agreement, or BLA, as you see also here on the slide, to FDA to actually review the new gene therapy. So we see this wave of new gene therapies coming to the FDA, and I can promise you the number of staff to actually review all these new gene therapies is not keeping up with that wave that you see on the graph there. So this is why MDA, one of the very first things we asked for within the letter that we submitted last year, was additional resources and expertise to review gene therapies at the Food and Drug Administration. But this right here is when I want to bring in Sharon, Dr. Hesserly, because while I know, the regulatory nature of gene therapies reasonably well, Dr. Hesserly knows the nuances of actually developing new gene therapies with the neuromuscular diseases. And she can also speak specifically to not just the overall wave of gene therapies across all disease areas, but specifically gene therapies in neuromuscular diseases. So Sharon, I wanted to ask you this question. We see these new gene therapies being developed in neuromuscular diseases. Can you tell us a little bit more about gene therapy development in neuromuscular diseases, and why it will be important for FDA to have not just the resources, but also the actual expertise in-house to review these innovative neuromuscular disease gene therapies in the ensuing few years?
Yeah, so I mean, the growth in gene therapy that we see on this chart actually, proportionately is happening in the neuromuscular space as well, where we're seeing a higher and higher percentage of new therapy developments focused on gene therapy. So in the neuromuscular space, you may know, there's been a lot of activity. Obviously in SMA, we have an approved drug, which is pretty amazing. There's a lot of activity in Duchenne with 3 trials going on in the US right now, but plenty more in planning. So we see a lot of stuff at the preclinical stage. So we know that those 3 trials are the tip of the iceberg. There's more coming. We've seen trials, I think there's one just about to start in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy for AskBio, and then Sarepta has done some work in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy as well as Duchenne, myotubular myopathy, of course. So we're seeing the trials in Pompe disease as well. And even things where we don't have trials yet, we know they're in the planning stage. So myotonic dystrophy, FSHD, for example, Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, in the preclinical stage, I've seen plans and companies are preparing to launch all of these. So we're seeing the same thing proportionately, I think, in the neuromuscular space. And I think the key thing is definitely the FDA needs to have the resources to manage these. So every major pharmaceutical company now has a gene therapy program of some sort, as well as a rare disease program. And a lot of their gene therapies are focused on rare diseases because they're often genetic, and it's often a single gene that's involved. So we call that monogenetic. So they're good targets for gene therapy. So there's definitely a need for resources at the FDA level to review these. And there's also a need for better training and resources out there in the clinical space. So all of the clinical trialists who are working in the space need to understand how to do a gene therapy trial. And there are some things that are a little bit different about gene therapy that require some expertise. And then when you have an approval, people need to understand, payers have to understand how to get these approved. And your clinical, your doctors and physicians have to understand how to finagle the insurance request to get these things approved. So there's this whole level of learning and infrastructure that needs to be in place for these. I think we're starting to see it kind of come about organically, but it's probably not keeping up. So.
Yeah, that you hit the nail on the head there, Dr. Hessley. That's exactly right. We need more resources everywhere, including the FDA, to actually be able to keep up with the science, as the science has truly accelerated in gene therapy development within neuromuscular diseases specifically, even for that matter, which is incredibly exciting. And we would not want there to be a time in which the reason for why a gene therapy has not reached one of our patient populations is simply because FDA hasn't had the right people, or FDA can't work quickly enough. That cannot be a reason for why a truly transformational gene therapy that otherwise has flown through clinical trials and has shown that it is truly safe and effective, for why that new therapy shouldn't be able to reach our community that much quicker. So very pleased, of course, to see this within the agreement that FDA and regulated industry have made. And this is exactly the reason why we called for this in our comment letter last summer. Now, it's not just resources and expertise that this agreement will include for gene and cell-based therapeutic development. There'll also be a patient-focused drug development meeting on gene therapies the FDA will hold, so that all of us can, well, really all of you can go to the FDA and tell them about your perspectives on gene therapy and the risks that you're willing to potentially incur for the benefits that a gene therapy may bring. Again, this is a very innovative space, and FDA doesn't always understand, oftentimes doesn't understand, I should say, the patient perspective on the risks and benefits that they're willing to incur for new gene therapy. And so this meeting will help instruct that. Also, as part of this provision within the agreement, are efforts to further the science of establishing efficacy in novel treatments in small patient populations. And this is especially important within rare diseases and ultra rare diseases, really, because it is incredibly complex to actually run a clinical trial in a disease in which there might only be a handful of individuals in the United States with that disease. And Dr. Hessley, I want to turn back to you, because this is something that I know that you're paying very close attention to, actually how clinical trials are run within ultra rare disease patient populations, and the challenges that accompany pharmaceutical companies in actually trying to do these. So with the focus on this topic, including workshops and a guidance that the FDA wants to put forward, do you think that the focus is in the right place? And just tell us in general how these kinds of challenges affect neuromuscular disease drug development in the perhaps rarest neuromuscular diseases.
Yeah, so this is a big problem, I think, that we've had in the field. When you look at the orphan drugs that are approved, a rare disease is considered anything that affects under 200,000 people in the United States. That's how we define it. But actually, I know in the corporate world, there are about 600 non-cancer rare genetic diseases that are actually considered quote unquote commercial, meaning they have a big enough market to make them worthwhile to pursue. And that leaves, if you consider there's 6,000 rare genetic diseases, that's the long tail of rare genetic diseases. There are all of these other diseases that aren't really being tackled. And part of it is the, commercial appeal. But the other part of it is just the regulatory risk. And what I mean by that is the fact that you have a small number of people. So what the FDA would like to see in an ideal world is 2 well-controlled phase 3 clinical studies showing evidence of, safety and efficacy before they agree to approve a drug. Now, they've made some modifications in rare disease. They understand you probably can't do that. In rare disease, you don't always need 2 well-controlled trials to get the drug approved. You can do it with 1 trial. And you can do it with smaller numbers of patients. But the problem is they still want to see a statistically significant improvement in the efficacy. And it's very hard to do with small numbers of patients. It's also very hard to really understand safety with small numbers of small numbers of data too. So we're kind of at a point with the regulatory situation where something's got to give, because the alternative is that we can't do drug development for some of these diseases that affect maybe 30, 40, 50 people. How are we going to do that? So I think that's something that the FDA recognizes. I know I've heard talks from Peter Marks, who oversees this part of the FDA, who says he recognizes that we've got to be able to do clinical trials more efficiently. We may have to get away from the p-value, which is, what determines what is statistically significant, and that's just, completely off the wall, right? To have that discussion with the FDA. But we've got to do something. There are some creative things you can do. There are different types of statistical analyses. You can use Bayesian statistics, which is a sort of very different mathematical approach to understanding how things change over time, or you can kind of follow an individual patient and get some idea if a change is meaningful. So the FDA is kind of baby stepping in that direction. So I think to the extent that this PDUFA agreement addresses some of those problems, I think it's helpful. It probably, again, doesn't go far enough for some of the ultra rare diseases. And that's something that we were focused on at MDA, because I think at last look, we cover really over about 300 genetic neuromuscular diseases. And of those, little bit over 20 actually affect more than 1,000 people in the US. The others affect less than 1,000 people, but there are an awful lot of them. And they add up to a lot of people. So we need to figure out how to do this with the FDA. So I think this is a step in the right direction. I don't think it's going to go far enough, especially for those diseases that affect maybe 50 or 100 people. We're going to need more creative approach to that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Hesterly. I think you're exactly right that the issues that face therapeutic developers who want to develop a new treatment for that ultra rare patient population of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 patients, for one, is certainly not going to just be solved within one workshop or guidance series that FDA may put forward, but also exist beyond the scope of FDA's jurisdiction. It also has to do with payers and has to do with other facets of our scientific research, drug development, and access ecosystem that certainly just can't be solved within one shot at the goal, in a sense, which may end up being this part of this agreement. We have a couple questions in the Q&A that I want to be able to answer now as we're talking about this gene therapy work. And there's a few more things that we're going to get to on gene therapy here in a moment. We had a question from Donovan about when will the patient listening meeting be for the gene therapy. And that, as part of the agreement, would need to happen by the end of fiscal year 2023. So by October 23, so basically by about this time, 2 years from now, is when the meeting would have had to happen. So considering that this agreement, hopefully, knock on wood, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, be passed by Congress sometime mid next year or so, we would expect this meeting to be sometime next fall, maybe winter, maybe early spring for that matter. Maybe even a little bit later than that, but certainly by this time, 2 years from now. Another question on whether the meeting will be patient-initiated or FDA-initiated. This is an FDA-initiated meeting, so this is not an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, which will also give a little bit more detail on the evolution of that effort here in a moment, but that this is specifically led by FDA. And you're right, this is not a disease-specific PFDD meeting whatsoever. And it's not an entirely new phenomenon. FDA has other PFDD meetings, or has had other PFDD meetings that are technology specific. They have one on opioid use, for example, or it could be on kind of a class of technologies, or even a class of diseases for that matter. But this is, I believe, the first that they'll be doing on gene therapies specifically. And to Jessica's question, absolutely, we'll be looking to play a role in this meeting when it is to happen in fiscal year 2023. Okay, so I want to move to the next slide because there are still further things that this agreement would actually include on gene and cell-based therapy development. And to kind of continue along the vein of the challenges of developing gene therapies for ultra-rare diseases, this agreement would also include a public meeting on trial designs, and specifically using real-world evidence, including natural history data, as part of the effort to develop new gene therapies. And of course, this can be incredibly impactful with the neuromuscular diseases. And Dr. Hessler, I want to turn back to you about, how you could envision real world evidence or natural history data collected through any number of registries, but perhaps even through MDA's neuromuscular disease observational research hub or mover, could actually play a role within therapeutic development. And if you think that such rare real world evidence and other such data could actually be impactful in the development of new gene therapies.
Yeah, and I will just start by making clear. So what we mean by real world evidence. So that's data that's collected outside of a clinical trial. That might be collected systematically, but it's just not part of a trial that has a protocol that asks you to do certain things. It might be an observational trial. It still has a protocol, but we're not asking you to do anything that's outside of your normal daily activities. That's real world evidence. And I think the goal here is to augment the data that you can get in a trial, which in some cases may not be enough data. In fact, in rare disease, in any rare disease, it's never really enough data. Every source of data is really valuable. So it's saying outside of a clinical trial, there are all these other sources of data, and how can we use them systematically? So patient registries are, often a source of real world data. The Mda Mover Registry is collecting data at point of care. So if you come into your MDA care center for your regular appointment and you have agreed to participate in Mover and you're at a participating center, then all the data from your medical record from that visit gets uploaded into Mover. It's de-identified so that, it's made anonymous. But we have a record of sort of what's happening with you over time without any, other things. If you're taking a new medication or a new drug, we can track that and we can kind of look over time. So it's that kind of data that can be included along with whatever clinical trial data is available. And integrated to get a bigger picture of what's happening. And especially in gene and cell therapies, after someone is treated, this is a therapy that in theory is supposed to last for a very long time, whether it's a muscle or nerve. And over time, we need to be able to collect data to follow that. And you can't do a 10-year clinical trial. It's really difficult to do. The FDA does require that people be followed for a long time, but they're looking to these sources of real world evidence. They've sort of recognized it's not realistic to do a 10 or 15-year clinical trials. So these real world evidence is going to play a big role in finding out what happens to people over time after they've been treated. So I think, and actually even one of the specific things for cell and gene therapies, there's an RMAT thing that you can get that helps you get sort of an accelerated approval. And one of the things that RMAT says is that, potentially if you have an approval based on a biomarker and they require you to follow that up with a trial, you don't have to do a placebo-controlled trial. You can actually use real world evidence to support that, which is a big difference from having to do a trial, which is very difficult when you already have a drug on the market. So real world evidence will play a big role, especially in gene and cell therapies, is the short version of that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hesley. That was absolutely perfect. The final thing that I want to mention on gene and cell-based therapeutic development, an additional challenge that those who are actually developing these therapies face are the complications associated with chemistry, manufacturing, and control. And you see CMC on your slide here. That's the acronym for chemistry, manufacturing, and control. That's essentially all the challenges in actually just manufacturing the new therapy, as gene and cell-based therapies are incredibly complex. They bring a whole host of CMC complications. And so this agreement would also advance the field that much further, and FDA working with regulated industry in actually trying to knock down some of those challenges in manufacturing gene and cell-based therapies and all the challenges that exist today. So I want to move on from gene and cell-based therapy because there's still a lot more exciting things to mention within this PDUFA agreement. And I want to move along to things specific to rare diseases. So as I mentioned previously, there's already been rare diseases programs in existence at FDA for a little while at the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics. And this agreement would continue those efforts and would continue to allow these rare disease programs, these rare disease experts to assist the review divisions that review a new rare disease drug with that review. Now, there is a new program that's included within this agreement that we're very excited about, and that's the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot Program, RDEA pilot program. Rdea is the acronym that I use for this one in particular. And what this would do is it'd be a new program at the FDA in collaboration, not only with industry, but also with other stakeholders such as MDA and other patient advocacy organizations to actually develop new rare disease endpoints for clinical trials. We know that right now within rare disease drug development, oftentimes the most challenging aspect of developing and testing that new rare disease drug is having an endpoint that will adequately tell us whether the new drug actually works. This is very common, unfortunately, with the neuromuscular diseases, as we see antiquated endpoints continuing to be used in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and other muscular dystrophies, such as the 6-minute walk test. We see the ALS-FRS still being used within ALS, and as recent news over the last just few days have shown, can be very inadequate in showing improvements or slowing a progression within ALS. And even within a disease such as Charcot-Marie Tooth, outdated endpoints that don't actually capture the experience with the disease well. So we're excited about this program. However, the pilot program itself will only include a handful of conditions and a handful of endpoints, but there also will be accompanied with public workshops and other efforts for everyone else who isn't able to be actually included within the pilot program. We of course hope that it will continue from there after it is just a pilot, this next agreement. However, Dr. Hesley, I wanted to ask you to build on this, if you may, about the importance of endpoints within neuromuscular disease drug development, and perhaps you can add some color onto the challenges that drug developers face right now with endpoints in neuromuscular diseases and their adequacy or perhaps inadequacy, and if further efforts to actually create new endpoints within neuromuscular diseases are important.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people ask, why does industry keep using things like 6-minute time walk? I mean, I think they've actually gotten away from that a little bit, but that all came about. So the thing is, all this regulatory stuff just represents risk to companies. They don't know, if regulators are going to approve something. They don't know if the drug's going to work. Any way they can reduce risk, they try to do that. So they gravitated to the 6-minute time walk early on because it had been used specifically in Pompe disease to approve myozyme and some of the drugs there. So there was this history of using it in a neuromuscular disease. So, they're not like sheep necessarily, but there is this sense that it's already de-risked and they know the FDA will accept it, so they used it. I think with time, we realized that not only is it not a great endpoint for all neuromuscular disease, but the question of clinical meaningfulness comes up. So what that means is that the FDA isn't just interested in showing that you can, move some point on a scale. They want to understand what that means to you as a person living with neuromuscular disease. And I think for the muscle disease community, it was pretty frustrating at first because, back early in the day, and because I've been around for a long time, we had some meetings about what endpoints can we use. And people wanted to use quantitative muscle testing, where you go in and you use some equipment that you might move and grip something, and it measures the exact amount of that grip. It's very precise, really quantitative. The problem is the FDA wasn't buying it because they said, we don't understand what it means whether you score a 3 or a 4 on this quantitative muscle test. What does that actually mean? So we've moved to things that are more meaningful. So the 6-minute time walk was an attempt to get at endurance, like how, do you have greater endurance? And it really is a surrogate for, in your life, can you do things, go further without getting tired? But it's hard to measure those things that are actually really clinically meaningful. So that's been the sort of push-pull, is how do we get something we can actually measure routinely from one site to the next and from one visit to the next that's consistent, but is still clinically meaningful. And so that's been the sort of dance that we've been doing back and forth. 6-minute time walk was a stab at that. Other things have come along that are a little bit better. Maybe the 4-stair climb, the time to get up and go, where you stand up from a sitting position and go as fast as you can, whether you're walking or running. You can do that at every place but Sweden. And it turns out the Swedish word for go means run. So anyway, we found that out when we're doing these international trials. So endpoints are tricky, and for rare disease, they're important. For common disease, there's just been more energy and effort put into figuring out what the right endpoints are. In rare disease, probably every time you go from one disease to the next, you're really trying to refine what is the best thing you can do that will show something that's meaningful to you as the person with the disease that's also measurable. So those are sort of the challenge in a nutshell. And I think it's great that this program is going to really focus on this question, because it's a hard thing to do. It's tricky. And getting a new endpoint with enough data to say this is a really good endpoint takes a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And your historical knowledge and your understanding on all of this and its effect with the neuromuscular diseases is fantastic. Thank you again, Dr. Hesley, for bringing that to today's conversation. To move on to the next slide then, as we continue along, what else is within the PDUFA agreement? I already mentioned patient-focused drug development, and sure enough, there are next steps within patient-focused drug development, including continuing the externally led meetings. Here at Mda, of course, we held one just last year on Pompe disease, and we know that many other patient-focused drug development meetings have been held within our space, including on Charcot-Marie Tooth and SMA and Friedreich ataxia. And there are still others that are being planned right now, including for limb-girdle disease and for a handful of others as well. And this agreement would, of course, allow for not only those meetings to continue and FDA to continue to invest in those meetings, but also for the efforts to collect patient experience data and patient preference information and so forth that FDA launched last user fee agreement in 2018 for those efforts to continue as well. Now, what is new to this agreement is how to actually take the data that is collected either through externally led patient-focused drug development meetings or through other research endeavors or even through natural history efforts and make it regulatorily actionable. How can we make that data actually impactful to the FDA as they're considering not only just whether to approve a new therapy or not, but how the label should be crafted or dosing schedules or all the ways in which FDA and industry work together to try to, when approving a new therapy or considering the approval of new therapy, how can this data collected by groups such as Mda, but a lot of other groups for that matter as well, how can that data actually contribute to regulatory decision-making? And that is where the rubber is going to be hitting the road in this next PDUFA agreement, as there's going to be guidances and there's going to be workshops on that very question. And actually, it gets to a question that Brad Williams in the chat actually raised of how can we start even not using placebo controls in phase 3 eventually? And it might not necessarily be specifically through this effort, but still being able to use alternatives to placebo controls through use of real world evidence, as Dr. Hessler has already introduced us to, as well as through other data, that could be the way in which we do it. But I want to turn to you, Dr. Hessler, on that very question. And I'll mention before I do turn it over to you, there's a lot to discuss in today's meeting. We're probably going to go a few minutes past the hour, so would love it if anyone can stay. We are recording this though, and if you can't stay beyond the hour, you can catch the rest of it in the recording. We won't go too much further than that, but Dr. Hessler, back to you on, you've already partially answered this within the gene therapy question, but I wanted to pose it back to you again. The importance of actually making such data collected in the real world regulatorily actionable.
Yeah, so that's a big deal, especially with things like around patient preference and benefit risk. The FDA started these patient-focused drug development meetings after getting feedback that they needed to better understand benefit risk from the patient and not just be sitting or not use clinicians as surrogates for the patient experience, right? Which is what had been happening. So they implemented these, but then there was this question, okay, so you do them at the PFDD meeting, what happens then? Can you show me where in your decision making you're actually taking into account patient preference? And they couldn't, because they didn't have a formal way to do it. So I think the push now is just to say specifically, and maybe we need to legislate, that's the direction it's going, that you have to take this into account. You have to demonstrate, in your opinion, on this drug approval, how you took into account patient preferences for benefit risk. So are we measuring what's important to people? Are we taking in consideration how much benefit is important to people? So, for example, do you need to be able to improve your ability to walk, or is it important that you can pick your arm up to brush your hair? These are differences where, somebody from the outside might say, unless you have a dramatic benefit, this didn't work. Whereas you're saying, actually, it's hugely meaningful to my life to be able to do X. So all of these are patient preferences. And this is just a way of saying, you have to take this into account. You've got to show us how you did it. So I think that's key. And it's a really important step. And I think we've been hammering on this for a long time, that we're collecting data, collecting data systematically, some really nice benefit risk studies that have been done that are very rigorous. But then you hand that to the FDA and the FDA goes, okay, well, it's not in our framework. We're saying put it in your framework and show us how you're including it. So
100%. Yeah, that's exactly it. Finding the way in which these data actually fit into FDA's decision making, making it formal that they fit into FDA's decision making, and hopefully with these extra tools in FDA's toolbox, they can better make decisions that better reflect the wishes and the experiences of our communities. So 100% on that, and that's where real world evidence again can play in.
Yeah, and just to add something right quick to that too. I know we're short on time, but you know what struck me is in these PFDD meetings, for an agency that loves data, that is so data hungry, they always want to see the numbers, they want to see the statistics. For patient opinion, they did this sort of squishy meeting where there's lots of feels that come out of it, but there's nothing quantitative. And that was the challenge, is they didn't know what to do with those results. So this is a way, really to take something that maybe isn't quantitative and make sure that it's taken into account. So it's sort of bridging that gap. Like they got us halfway there with the PFDD meeting, but by their own design, set it up in a way that they didn't know how to use the outcome. So that's it. I'm off my soapbox on that.
No, that's quite okay. Thank you, Dr. Hessley. All right, let's move on to the next slide. There's just a few more things to mention about the PDUFA agreement, and then just a few words on the Medical Device User Fee Act. But of course, one of our main goals throughout all of this, as I said at the outset, is to actually accelerate the development of these treatments. And there are provisions within this agreement that would ostensibly do exactly that. The first being this creation of this new expedited approval pathway, which we're very excited about. And STAR stands for Split Real-Time Application Review. And this is an expedited approval pathway that's already been piloted in cancer that now can expand outside of cancer, that will allow FDA to actually review parts of the application as the company is still submitting other parts of the application for that matter. It'll be able to take more established aspects of what the company is doing, and rather than it all being just put into one big package and sent off to FDA at the same time, which is oftentimes how submitting an NDA actually works, FDA is able to kind of work ahead of time with other parts that are already better established, that FDA already understands fairly well, and that actually can cut the review time down that much more quickly. In fact, within cancer, there have been certain treatments that have been approved within just a handful of months, which is really remarkable when we think about FDA review timelines, as you saw within that slide earlier within our earlier within our presentation. There's also reforms to the breakthrough therapy pathway, which another expedited approval pathway to ensure that communication during the breakthrough therapy designation is able to actually accelerate the full process of developing a therapy, not just aspects of it. There's enhanced meeting structures, including expanding the Interact meetings that used to be just within the Center for Biologics across all drugs. There's also earlier interactions in the use of surrogate endpoints. And if Dr. Hessley, I can just ask for 30 seconds from you on the importance of surrogate endpoints with the neuromuscular diseases, because this is actually one of those areas that is really exciting and can truly accelerate development with the neuromuscular diseases.
Yeah, so and very quickly, so I talked a little bit about the importance of endpoints that are clinically meaningful. Well, those kinds of clinically meaningful endpoints take time to collect. They're usually functional, meaning they show you how you function. And they take a while to collect. So a surrogate endpoint is maybe something that you can measure that's much easier to measure, much more quantitative. And it predicts what's going to happen. This is the really important part. And you have to be able to demonstrate that it will consistently predict what's going to happen with that clinically meaningful endpoint. And if you have a tight enough relationship there, where you've shown over and over, for example, that if you elevate dystrophin, that you're going to have a functional improvement, then maybe you can get a drug approved just on the basis of the fact that it increases dystrophin. And that is actually the case for the Sarepta drugs that were approved. They were approved before they had a clinically meaningful functional readout. So these surrogates are important because you could potentially do, really cut a lot of time off drug development. The hard part is the first thing you have to do is prove that relationship. So up front, you don't really save time. You've got to show that whatever marker it is, whether it's neurofilament for ALS or something, will predict an outcome. That means you have to have at least one drug approved in that space to show that you do have a functional improvement, and then show how the surrogate relates to that functional improvement. So that's the key thing with surrogates. But when you can do that, a lot of times the FDA will require that you follow up and show the functional outcome eventually. But a good surrogate marker, that's like, if you have it all approved and you can demonstrate that relationship and it's well validated, will really cut time off your trial design.
Absolutely. And industry and FDA recognizing this, they are further investing in the accelerated approval pathway and the use of surrogate endpoints by ensuring that interaction between FDA and industry happens really as early as possible, to ensure that collaboration can happen as early as possible to facilitate the use of these surrogate endpoints in clinical trials thereafter. So certainly very pleased to see that provision within the agreement. And then finally, just two more things. This agreement also would continue the complex innovative trial designs pilot. We know there are many complex innovative trial designs with the neuromuscular diseases that could be benefited by additional FDA insights and investment, which this pilot would do. And then finally, I already mentioned CMC before in the context of gene therapies, control manufacturing and chemistry manufacturing control, actually technically the acronym, but then also aligning CMC with expedited approval pathways, as that it had gone a little bit out of out of alignment over the last little while of CMC having trouble keeping up with expedited approval pathways. Now there will be the investment to ensure that CMC is able to keep up with the timeline that expedited approval pathways actually would expect. So I think to move on to the next slide, just a few words on what's not within the PDUFA agreement, because as I mentioned, we submitted our proposals for what we wanted to see within the agreement last summer. And while we saw a lot to like within this user fee agreement as we've gone over here for the last, goodness, over half an hour at this point, there's still some things that we asked for that weren't included, including greater resources for patient-focused offices and endeavors, including the patient representative program and Office of Patient Affairs. We know that these offices play a very important role in actually liaising with the patient community and otherwise serving the community. And we unfortunately didn't see extra investment within these offices. We call for further trial innovation proposals and also further consistency across FDA review divisions and actually applying flexibility and innovation in reviewing new therapies. And while certain parts of the agreement will benefit certainly this last point pertaining to ensuring consistency across FDA review divisions, we still could have seen a little bit more. And we still could have also seen some of the pilots within the Oncology Center of Excellence, such as the STAR pilot program, which I mentioned, that is being expanded into non-cancer areas. There are other innovative pilots that we're really excited about, including Project Facilitate, which would actually increase the use of expanded access, which is getting a drug outside of a clinical trial while it's still within the clinical trial. We did not see such pilot programs within the Oncology Center of Excellence expanded outside of OCE. So those are things that we're going to continue to advocate for. And I'll get to that just in a moment, our continued advocacy. But before I do, just a few words on our friends over in the medical device space, because we can't forget about the importance of medical devices for not only our community, but all communities for that matter. So what's in the MDUFA agreement? Well, technically nothing yet, because there is no MDUFA agreement yet. They're still negotiating right now. Whereas the drug industry and FDA were able to come to an agreement earlier this year, the medical device industry and FDA have not come to such an agreement yet. And they did get started a little bit later, but they have some other things that they're trying to sort out that they just haven't actually been able to come to an agreement yet, as of yet. But there are still things that we know are being discussed, that are being negotiated, that we're excited about, including increased resources allocation to FDA by the medical device industry to ensure that medical devices get through the FDA that much more quickly, including an FDA proposal for a Total Product Life Cycle Advisory Committee, or a TAP, but just overall a Total Product Life Cycle efforts to better align medical device development and subsequent approval kind of across all the different facets involved, which right now is not really actually playing out and can very much delay the development of medical devices. Also strengthening of post-market surveillance, FDA is asking for. And then finally, a greater integration of real-world evidence, which we've discussed within the drug context, but it's also very important within the medical device context. So we don't have much more to say about MDUFA yet because we don't have a 80-page goals letter or commitment letter like we do that we can talk about for perhaps far too long within the context of the prescription drug space. But who knows, maybe we'll hold another advocacy institute on medical devices and the Medical Device User Fee Act whenever that goals letter is actually published. So I want to move to, I believe, just one or two more slides because we've been talking a lot about very important policies but haven't gotten yet to how you can help. And you absolutely can help make these new programs a reality. So as we mentioned before, right now we are in the comment stage where we're all going to write our comments and tell FDA and industry what we think about the commitment letter. And then from there, if confirmed and if amended by these comments, then the FDA will hand the agreement off to Congress and Congress then has to pass it. And that's where you're all going to come in because as you well know, your voice is incredibly important to your congressperson and to your senators in actually advocating for them to pass legislation. And this agreement will become legislation just like any of the other legislation that we advocate for, such as newborn screening or Act for ALS or Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. This will be a bill that will be a priority of MDA's next year in 2022, once it's actually up in Congress. I can tell you that right now, it will be one of our main priorities, and we're gonna need your help. We're gonna need your help to ensure that the conversation focuses on the patient experience, on how meaningful this agreement will be, not just to regulated industry or to FDA, but to the communities that would be benefited by having these programs in place. And the neuromuscular disease community is certainly one of them. In addition, this is a piece of legislation just like any other, and it needs to actually pass through reauthorize the FDA, and it always does. Thankfully, let's knock on wood that it does again for a 7th time next year. But it also gives us the opportunity to add additional beneficial legislation onto this existing beneficial legislation. So we could potentially even do better than what's in the agreement right now by adding other FDA-related priorities or incentives. And this could include bills that we're supporting now, bills that we're not yet supporting that could be very impactful to our community. But it gives us the chance to further reform the FDA than what's just within this commitment letter and add even more exciting things. Perhaps some of those things that I had mentioned just a few moments ago that we didn't actually get to be included within the final commitment letter. So it's through your voice that the urgency for actually passing this legislation, because of the urgency of getting new and better treatments to our community, it's through your voice that urgency will become clear to Congress so that these bills will become passed. Okay, Mark, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for anything more that you want to mention on this specific point or anything further from there.
No, I think you're right. I think, we really wanted to give this webinar just with such an important topic that we hear all the time. We wanted to let you know what we're doing and how we're trying to improve the process, improve FDA for the neuromuscular community. So we really wanted to have this to show you that what we're doing, and then let you know when you hear from us next year, probably this is why. And this is why it's so important for you to take action when the time is right. We're not quite there yet, but we'll get there pretty soon. So again, if you're not a member of our grassroots network, please join at mda.org/advocacy, and you'll know when it is right time to make your voice heard when it gets into Congress, and we really need you to raise your voice. So this is like a little primer. A little primer for that when it happens next year. But it's such an important topic. We wanted to make sure you knew about it before you see it. So I think with that, I know that we still over time, but there are still some questions, Paul, and if we want to answer real quick, I'm sure some folks might have stayed on the line just to see if they get them answered. So I think we should make sure we can do that for them. So Paul, if you want to take away some of the questions you'd like to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you everyone again for submitting questions in the Q&A box. Apologies if here we are 11 minutes past the hour, you submitted a question, you had to hop off. But please do watch the recording if possible for the answers to your questions. Also, before I get to these, a big thank you to Dr. Hesterly. Unfortunately, she did have to hop off herself. We can only ask for so much of her time, certainly, but a big thank you to her for joining us and talking this agreement with us today. So Nancy had a question about if passed, would the ALS bill benefit the PDUFA agreements? And what Nancy, I believe, is referring to is the Act for ALS, which is legislation we briefed you on previously, a bill that, while named after ALS, would actually benefit all rare neurodegenerative disease conditions through new programs at the FDA. And if passed, would the bill benefit PDUFA? Yes, in the way in which this bill would be creating new FDA programs that could play into some of the reforms that are also included within this legislation that actually complement themselves very nicely. Within the Act for ALS, there's the HHS Collaborative, or public-private partnership, that would look for ways to accelerate neurodegenerative disease drug development. And those ways to accelerate that development could play into the ways in which the expedited approval programs will be reformed within PDUFA, or the endpoints will be developed within the rare disease endpoint advancement program. So, they will complement each other very nicely if Act for ALS ends up being enacted, which we very much hope that it will. And of course, the PDUFA agreements end up being enacted next year. Also a question about how it's introduced as a bill or part of Congress. It will be, as part of a budget. And it will be introduced as a bill, just like any other bill, sometime next year. How likely is it to get passed? I would give it a 99% chance it will get passed, just because if it doesn't, the FDA will essentially cease to operate. And I don't think anyone wants the FDA to cease to operate. Because about 60% or so of FDA funding, I believe, comes from user fees. And if you cut 60% of their budget, that's going to be very bad for a quarter of our economy. So that's not likely to happen. It's likely going to pass, but really the rubber hits the road in what is actually within the legislation, and making sure that Congress understands the urgency of including all of these aspects within the legislation, and that there isn't any lapse in passing the bill. As there have been other lapses in passing very important bills, like we're experiencing right now with the newborn screening, where it's been over 2 years since the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Reauthorization Act has lapsed, and we're still advocating for passage of that. So just paints the picture of, even if it's still very likely to pass, we got to make sure we're giving it our all with our advocacy. Just a couple other questions that came in the Q&A box, Mark, before we close. Question from Josh about where we stand on endpoints for non-ambulatory patients, and it's a great point, Josh, about needing endpoints for non-ambulatory patients. And Sharon mentioned a couple efforts ongoing pertaining to developing endpoints that are reflective of movement in the arms, for example, or other movement-based endpoints that, if not used right now as primary endpoints, will hopefully be used sooner rather than later, because Josh points out very well that there are far too many clinical trials that exclude non-ambulatory patients right now, simply because the endpoint in the clinical trial has to do with ambulation. And that excludes a whole host of individuals within the neuromuscular disease community from actually being able to participate within clinical trials. And that really is tragic. So the development of such endpoints that don't rely on ambulation certainly is a priority of MDAs, and we'll try to make it a priority of initiatives within this efforts, and would also be a priority, for example, with an Act for ALS, as one of the main reasons for why rare neurodegenerative disease drug development is not going as we would like it to go, and needs to be a priority across all stakeholders to ensure that we can do better for those who are non-ambulatory. One final question, I believe, from Crystal, yes, is if we can provide links to documents and so forth. We're happy to provide a link to the commitment letter. For those of you still here, I can put a link in the chat right now. For those of you who are going to be attending this later, we'll figure out some way to, to include it within our resources. But certainly, if you want to read 80+ pages of heavy regulatory language, please click on that link and enjoy some light reading this evening. Mark, I think that probably takes us to the end of our questions. Anything that we should close with?
No, thank you for all your questions. Probably one of the more sessions that one of the more questions we've seen, and it's really exciting. It's a really important topic. So I'm glad you're able to join us. Thank you for staying over time. We truly appreciate it. Paul, I think you have something to say.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I realized I just put in the chat box only to panelists and not to attendees as well. So you wouldn't have been able to read the document. Now, hopefully, if you click on that link, you can if you want to. Again, fair warning, it might put you to sleep, but it is everything that we have just been talking about for the last 40 minutes or so.
Excellent. Thank you for that. But thank you all for staying 15 minutes over. We truly appreciate it. The email address is on the bottom, is in the final slide. I answer those personally. So if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out and we'll get back to you. And thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you on the next edition of our Advocacy Institute. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.